Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks for joining us tonight. I am Anya Kavarkis, the head of the Department of Art, and I wanted to introduce you to John Weber, who's the executive director of the JSMA for how many years now?
Oh, just
Three short years in the pandemic that we're excited now we get to start collaborating on things more. And he will be introducing our special guest, Marie Watt. So welcome, John, and welcome, Marie, and I'll pass it off to you.
Hi, and I do want to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land here, and particularly important for today's talk. As her website states, Marie Watt is an American artist. She is a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians and also has German-Scot's ancestry. And if you've seen her superb two pieces that are now on view in the Mini West show at the JSMA, one, a mural-sized textile piece that examines the indigenous Northwest Coast tradition of the potlatch, and one, a stunning wood carving of a stack of blankets. You've had a taste of her material range, intellectual scope, and the social, historical, political acuity of her work. Both pieces are highlights of the show, and I'm honored to say that the textile work titled Witness Kwame-chan Potlatch 1913 is in the JSMA's collection. Over the course of a career that is now deep into its third decade, Watt has been probably most known for strikingly original textile works that periodically incorporate text, social practice methodologies, the frequent use of highly sculptural form to encompass a wide range of questions and investigations that she herself lists as history, biography, community, Iroquois protofeminism, storytelling, Indigenous teachings, and more. But along with creating a body of work that completely explodes preconceived notions of textile-based art, she's also created major pieces in wood, glass, printmaking series, and more. And her current show at PDX Gallery in Portland, which just opened about a week ago, features a 27-foot-long text-based work in neon light tubing titled Shared Horizon Western Door. And that will be on view in Portland through December 3. Those who were at the JSMA 2 years ago may recall her huge, wonderfully aromatic sculpture in cedar, Companion Species, which was the centerpiece of the Hallie Ford Fellows exhibition. She holds an MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University and degrees from Willamette University and the Institute of American Indian Arts and an honorary doctorate from Willamette. She has attended residencies at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and the Vermont Studio Center and has received fellowships from Anonymous Was a Woman, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Harpo Foundation, the Ford Family Foundation, the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, and others. She's also done a lot of art service on the board, for example, of VoCA, Voices in Contemporary Art, on the Native American Advisory Committee of the Portland Art Museum, and since 2020 as a member of their Board of Trustees. She describes herself as a fan of Crow's Shadow, the Indigenous-founded printmaking institute located in the homelands of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, and also a fan of Portland Community College. Based in Portland, Marie Watt has an emphatically national profile as an artist. Her work is in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Seattle Art Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York, the Yale University Art Gallery, the Crystal Bridges Museum, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, and the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery, also the Tacoma Art Museum, the Denver Art Museum, the Portland Art Museum, and, as I said, the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art here at the University of Oregon. She's represented in Portland by PDX Contemporary Art, in San Francisco by Catharine Clark Gallery, and in New York City by Marc Straus Gallery. It is an honor and a pleasure to have her here with us. Please join me in welcoming Marie Watt and thanking her for coming to the University of Oregon.
Thank you. That was a very nice introduction. Okay, how's the sound? Excellent. All right. It's such an honor to be here. I also wanted to acknowledge where we are today. I want to thank my hosts here at the University of Oregon. Thank you, John, for that amazing and generous introduction. I want to thank everybody at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art who has assisted in hosting me here, as well as friends and colleagues in the art department. I look forward to meeting with students tomorrow. As a part of my practice, I also just want to acknowledge people who've collaborated in past events, and I would like to acknowledge my studio team, who I affectionately refer to or call the Brain Trust, who kind of help with these endeavors coming together. So first, I wanted to just share this image of my family. My husband likes to call this image 3 generations of Seneca teeth. And here I am with my mother and grandmother on the Columbia side, the Washington side of the Columbia River, looking at the petroglyph, She Who Watches. I want to also acknowledge my family for being supportive of my art practice, and I think some of you in the audience, the art students in particular, might identify with this. When I called home to tell my parents late in my sophomore year that I was going to be an art major, they didn't discourage me, but rumor has it that behind the scenes they were worried that I would be flipping hamburgers for a living. One thing that I admire about my parents is that they decided that they'd try to understand my interest in the arts, and one of the things they did is they actually became members of the Seattle Art Museum, and they are like the most devoted museum attendees. Like they go to a lot of lectures, and they're very engaged in what I do as an artist today, and part of it is about that kind of work that they've put into like having this connection with me, their kid. I also want to acknowledge that I consider my parents my roadies, and here they are helping me at the Aldrich Museum of Art in Connecticut, installing a piece called Dwelling. Today I want to talk a little bit about sovereignty. I am a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians. We are a sovereign nation in Western New York, about an hour outside of Buffalo. We are one of the 6 tribes that make up the Haudenosaunee, or as the French used to call us, the Iroquois Confederacy. Sovereignty, according to Webster's dictionary, means supreme power over body politic and freedom from external control. I think sovereignty and visual sovereignty are an undercurrent in the show, Many Wests, and also a through line in what is happening in art museums and American art collections throughout the United States. Today, sovereignty weighs heavy on Indigenous nations as the Supreme Court is hearing arguments relating to the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is tethered to Indigenous sovereignty. So this is an image of our clan symbol, and it includes our 8 clans. And we have 4 clans that are birds and 4 clans that are animals. And I come from the turtle clan. Our clans are passed on through our mothers. I come from a matrilineal society. And traditionally, you would marry the opposite. So I would marry a person in the bird clan. While my husband Adam is non-native, his personal moniker as a graphic designer is the crow. And so I feel like I've retained balance in that relationship. It's not lost on me that Susan B. Anthony has a resemblance to George Washington in this image, called Susan Anthony with Woodland's Influence. Susan Anthony's speechwriters, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, lived in Seneca Falls, New York, in proximity and relationship to Seneca and Haudenosaunee women. The suffragists admired the sovereign rights of Haudenosaunee women, which included passing down our tribal enrollment, our clan lineage, voting rights, land rights, and have always been the historic domain of women in our community. I think it's important to know that when I went to college, I was a little bit confused by this ideas about feminism, because in my family and in my experience, women always led, And I started to realize that they were proto-feminists, as am I. So when I was in school or getting out of my undergraduate program in the 1990s, I could only find 3 books on that had contemporary Indigenous artists in them. And so this is an example of the books that I felt like held most dear to me. And I realized that for some of you, 30 years might seem a long time ago, but it does sometimes like almost feel like just yesterday. It does not that long ago. And I'm glad to say that today there's more books on Indigenous artists, queer artists, BIPOC artists, but I think we still have a long way to go. And once again, Many Wests is an exhibit that is starting to kind of bring a lot of these artists who've been here forever into the spotlight. So in 2004, 2003, I started using blankets as a material, and I had no idea I would be working with them 20 some odd years later. But the very first blankets that I started working with, I had this idea that I wanted to make a column of folded and stacked blankets. And I was drawn to this material because of how blankets are used in my family and community. We give a blanket away to honor somebody for being witness to an important life event. I also was aware of how other Indigenous communities use blankets. And one of the things that I realized is I would buy like blankets from thrift stores, anything $5 and under. As I started kind of amassing these blankets to build this kind of columnar form, friends and family would start commenting on the blankets, and they would sort of see a blanket and start to talk about how a blanket's color, texture, bindings reminded them of their grandmother, and they would kind of break into a story. And that's one of the things that has like kind of drawn me to using these objects. So one thing that I want to point out with this particular piece on screen, Blanket Stories, Cousin Rose, 4 Pelts, and Sky Woman and Relations, is that maybe before I started working with blankets, I would have told you that they were sort of rectangular or square, but I've come to think of blankets as really being pelt-like and skin-like, and I think that sort of like a lot of the blankets I use are wool blankets, and they come from our relative, the sheep, and so blankets have hips, right? I started to explore other relationships with materials that I thought were blanket-like, and so in the foreground you can see this piece called Canopy, and I was interested in how wood is also blanket-like in the way it shelters and protects us. The grain of wood is oftentimes resembles sort of the movement of fabric. And the other thing that I really like about working with reclaimed wood is that it's not uncommon for a piece of timber that's been, say, downed like 50 or 100 years, but I could like go back and carve into it, and it might still yield sap. And even the kind of cracking that you see in the wood, that actually, I'm trying to remember what the word is, that cracking though is sort of indicator of the wood breathing, right? In the far left-hand side, there's a bronze piece, and I also around this time was thinking about how bronze has been used historically to create statues honoring, let's face it, white men, and also, say, majors and generals on horseback. And I started to think about how blankets, how important blankets are in our lives, and how they're markers for memories, and they receive us into this world as infants, and they actually accompany our departure too. And so it made sense to me to convert this humble object into bronze. As the blankets began to amass, I became reminded of how they relate to grandmother's childhood security blankets and family-made coverlets. And one of the things that I started to do is I started collaborating with communities, and this was a project done with the Denver Art Museum when I was an artist in resident. And in this particular project, we invited the community to contribute a blanket and a blanket story. And this is one of the very first sculptures in which every single blanket in this column was donated and given by somebody in the community. One thing to know when an invitation to participate in sharing a blanket goes out is that if people want to keep their favorite blanket or their family blanket, I'm always happy to offer a proxy in its place, or another blanket that is a stand-in for that blanket could be contributed. But one thing that I find really unique about this, this particular project is that oftentimes people, in fact, give the blanket that is storied. And I think that it relates to wanting those stories to be shared and told in community and in relationship with other stories. When people contribute a blanket to a project too, I acknowledge that exchange with a small, unique print. So simultaneous to working with blankets, I started in 2004 working with sort of like hand-constructed pieces that would hang from a wall or out in space. And so this is an early sewing circle when my house was my studio was at my house. And early on, these sewing circles, I would invite people and I would tell them I could feed you. No sewing experience was required. You could come and go as you wished. And one of the things that I loved about what happened is that when your eyes are busy and you're working with something as familiar with cloth, stories tended to flow. So one of the things that I'm so interested in with the satin bindings is I think of them as being very ledger-like and kind of recording our dreams. And so it's one of the references in those binding pieces. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about the piece Witness, in part because it's in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum collection here at the University of Oregon, as well as in the exhibition upstairs. So I was an artist research fellow at the Smithsonian, and around this time I had heard that at potlatches there would be so many blankets gathered that they oftentimes would hit the, like, kind of touch the rafters within a longhouse. And so I started looking around for these images, and while I didn't find the image of blankets touching the rafters of a longhouse, I found and came across this image of a Quamachan potlatch. And as I looked at it, one of the things I noticed is that this is a pile of a stack of blankets right here. And the other thing that I realized is that the date of this photo is 1913. And so I think the thing that I quickly realized the longer I looked at this image is that between 1885 and 1951, potlatches were banned both in the United States and Canada. A potlatch, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, is an elaborate feast accompanied by ecstatic giving and part of the social economy of tribal nations living along the Pacific Northwest coast of Canada and the US. So one of the things that struck me about this image is this blanket that was kind of flying through the air. So the family hosting the potlatch is up on like kind of near the roof top over there. And there's this blanket that's flying through space. And at the time I was doing this research fellowship, I learned that Cradle boards at the National Museum of the American Indian are categorized as transportation objects. And when I saw that blanket in space, I thought, wow, this is like this transportation object flying in space. And I was also struck by people's arms sort of reaching out to try to receive this particular blanket. So one of the things that struck me about this image and the date of it is that this gathering was an act of civil disobedience. And in order to kind of reflect that, I decided to make or translate people's outstretched hands as fists to show that it was an act of civil disobedience and a community celebration. I decided that I would also include my daughters and myself in this portrait, and so we're present as guests at the potlatch in the lower right-hand corner. And as a child growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I was able to attend a potlatch for Vi Hilbert, who was an honored elder who was known for kind of reviving the Lakshid language in the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to share that sometimes when, as I do research as an artist, I find additional images. And one image I found was this particular Edward Curtis photo that I've reversed so you could kind of see its relationship, to the original photo. And that photo would have been a photogravure, and so the image actually in the printing process came out backwards. If that makes sense. Oh, one last thing. All right, so an important thing to know about this blanket is it's a trade blanket. It was, it came here probably from England, and it would have been shipped with instructions on where to cut it so it could become 2 blankets. And I like to say that it's kind of an example of this early tax loophole, right? And so they would only be taxed on 1 blanket instead of 2. And then there's 4 bars on the blanket, and those are oftentimes not the colored bars, but those 4 black kind of fingered-like bars. Those are referred to as points. And so traditionally, those points referred to the quality of the blankets, and then therefore kind of the equivalent goods and services you could have exchanged that blanket for. So there's also oftentimes kind of smaller pieces I'm making simultaneous to the large pieces. I next wanted to share a little bit about a time when I was an artist in resident at the Denver Art Museum. And I had gone there as an artist in resident, and while there I had opened to the community sewing circles, and students, or not students, but actually anybody could drop into this kind of artist space. And while there I met these 2 young women who were powwow dancers. And one shared her story of being a jingle dress dancer, and the other shared her story of being a fancy shawl dancer. And so I knew I was coming back to the Denver Art Museum to install the sculpture that I showed previously. And I had hoped, knowing that I was coming back during the Denver Art Museum's annual powwow, that I would have run into these young women again. And I had created a piece that was in response to their stories. And so this is a sewing circle that was happening simultaneous to the powwow dancing. And this is the piece Butterfly that resulted from that collaboration. This was the first time that I incorporated jingles in my work, and one of the things that I realized is that if the work stayed against the wall as it had been kind of historically presented, that it would feel still, and I decided that it needed to move away from the wall so it could kind of communicate the sense that it could be activated and the sound of the jingles might occur. I've more recently used jingles in pieces like this project, Companion Species, Floating and Held. And one of the things that I am interested in this particular piece is this kind of relationship to call and response that I'll elaborate on a little bit more. But I also started to realize how I wanted to be able to make the jingles more interactive. And so currently I have a project up right now at the Stello Arts Gallery in Portland, Oregon. It's a nonprofit space. And I've created these forms. I think this is actually... And so I'm still very much like trying to figure out how to get the sound element engaged in a way where people know that they can touch them without being invited just to touch them. But and it's one of the reasons why I consider these pieces prototypes, but I'm excited about their progress. So I think one of the things that I want to share with you about jingles is that the very first jingle dress dance was created during a pandemic, but this pandemic was influenza. And it is storied that a young girl was very sick in an Anishinaabe community, and the medicine man had a vision on how they might heal this child. And in the vision, they were instructed to create a dress and adhere the jingles to the dress and do a very particular dance. And if done properly, then the child might heal. And so we can assume, based on the long tradition now of the jingle dress dance, that the child did get better, and that the dance then was shared with neighboring tribes, and it was shared beyond that. And now the jingle dress dance is actually a dance that is also done in powwows. And the sound that the jingles make is considered a healing sound. Okay. So more recently, I've been thinking, or I should say I've been asking the question, what would the world look like if we considered ourselves companion species? And for me, that question really came out of this understanding from the Seneca and Haudenosaunee creation story, in which Sky Woman falls from this hole in the sky world. And as she falls, she's first assisted by birds and then by animals, and they help her set up her new life on what we now call Turtle Island. And so as a result of the way animals help Sky Woman, we have clans that are named after animals, and we consider animals our first teachers. And because of that, and I would also say that not only are animals our first teachers, but then we're also related to the natural world as well. So I started thinking, well, what is the entry point? If you're not kind of raised with that sort of understanding of relatedness, then what's the entry point? And I started to think about, in Western culture, our relationship with dogs. And so I did some research, and I was struck by this image of the she-wolf nursing Remus and Romulus. And I think one of the things that stands out about this image is just how her body is a shelter, her ribs are visible, and she's emaciated because she's given everything to these plump twins or demigods nutritionally. Her eyes are droopy and very exhausted, and yet you still feel like she might become ferocious at a moment's notice. The other thing that I also started thinking about is, what is this word mother? How do we all have mother-like attributes? The Capeltine wolf is not a biological mother, but is mothering these twins. So this is one of the very first pieces in which I did an open to the community sewing circle with text. And all the words it generated are words that have sort of mother-like attributes. And the words started by me generating the list, and then they were further generated with students at Northwestern University in collaboration with a visit to the Block Museum. And this is some images from the open to the community sewing circles there. I think one thing I'd like to share about the sewing circles is that I don't think of the sewing circles as a means to an end as much as an opportunity for people to gather and exchange stories. And in a way, what's created at the sewing circles is created by everybody who's there. I like to say that one of my roles is sort of setting the table. And at the sewing circles, I also like to give prints to participants to acknowledge this exchange. So again, this is probably one of the earliest pieces where I was starting to use text, but on a smaller, more intimate scale in my studio. And this piece is actually kind of the artifact to the next image I'm going to show you. So this is a print, an etching, and it started actually by using that cloth that you saw in the previous frame. It started by using that on a soft ground plate and running it through the press. And so there was never any embroidery on the cloth. It was just the cloth itself. And then I used text on this, and then the embroidery started to happen on the other piece. So when I started thinking about this word mother, or maybe I should just say I was mother obsessed, it made me rethink the way I was listening to the Marvin Gaye song, What's Going On. And I think one thing that's really important to know is kind of the story about this song. And it really started with the man on the left, Obie Benson, who was a member of the Four Tops. And he was on a bus in Berkeley, and he saw this anti-war protest happening, and he asked himself the question, what's going on? And so one of the things that caught my attention is this call in the song, which goes mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister, father, father. And what I started to think about is how it signals our relatedness beyond a biological construct. It seems as much of an anthem for today as it was when Marvin Gaye produced it. And I will say, when I started really thinking about this song, and I started thinking about this intersection between what I like to call Marvin Gaye, Marvin Gaye's ideas about our relatedness intersecting with indigenous ideas about relatedness. And so in an indigenous way, that call goes on, and it includes grandmother, grandmother, grandfather, grandfather, auntie, auntie, uncle, uncle, and it also includes sky, sky, and turtle, turtle, and tree, tree. So the other thing that's important to note is that when I was listening to this song and thinking about what was happening socially and politically in the moment, we had the conflict at Standing Rock. There was the Flint water crisis. We have the climate protests, and the list goes on. I would actually even kind of add the pandemic to that. In this piece, the declaration, mother is a name. Mother is a term of endearment, at least if you have a mother like mine. Mother is the earth. But I also appreciate or wonder about mother sometimes being part of an expletive. This piece is called Companion Species, Calling Companion Species. So I also started thinking about tongues, and I just love this painting by Asher Wertheimer by John Singer Sargent. And it's a very Vermeer-esque painting for any of you who love the history of that medium in particular. And what I love is how light, just sort of little bits of light, move us around the composition. But I really love this moment, right? And I started to think about how this dog's tongue and my tongue were kind of an emblem of our relatedness. And it led to this study called Companion Species, Tongue, Petal, that's created. It's probably my first return to painting, but I did the painting in order to like realize this out of French knots. And then this larger piece, Companion Species, Field. I think that our tongues give us this responsibility to stand up and speak on behalf of those entities and that cannot speak up for themselves. One of my youngest studio assistants. I also think of this form not just as tongue-like, but maybe megaphone-like. It's a kind of reoccurring theme. This drawing I realize I've used for like a lot of kind of source material, but it also was a source for this piece with the Corning Museum of Glass. It was created in collaboration with Jeff Mack and a crew of gaffers at Corning. And one thing that was so exciting is that I knew I wanted to work sculpturally, and I just hadn't figured out how to take the steps there. And after collaborating with Jeff, I realized this particular piece, which actually was exhibited here last year at the JSM. And I thought I would share a little image of how this was created in my studio at the time. So sometimes I take on ambitious projects without completely understanding the ramifications of this, although I did try to like think this out a little bit more than other things I've done. But I have to share right now, I like store a 1.5 ton, 20-piece cedar canine wolf in my basement. But on the other hand, this piece breaks into 20 pieces, and it can get through a 60-inch door frame, and it smells. I'm like interested in the way smell intersects with the experience of the piece, and I have no regrets. So I was really interested in how, like with our pets and in our own bodies, how our underbelly is really like the most vulnerable place on us, right? And one of the reasons why I wanted to work so large was I was so interested in like kind of changing the story or narrative about man having dominion over animals, because I see our relationship like really in quite the reverse. In a lot of my work, you will see a relationship or an interest or preoccupation with between sky and ground, and I would say a lot of this has to do with our creation story. Recently, I did a collaboration with the Whitney Museum of Art. It is a collaboration that led up to a sewing circle at the museum, but it started with this poem called Singing Everything by Joy Harjo. The poem reads, "Once there were songs for everything, songs for planting, for growing, for harvesting, for eating, getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, mind break, and war, for death. Those are the heaviest songs, and they have to be pried from the earth with shovels of grief. Now all we hear are falling in love songs and falling apart after falling in love songs. The earth is leaning sideways, and a song is emerging from the floods and fires. Urgent tendrils lift towards the sun. You must be friends with silence to hear. The songs of guardians of silence are the most powerful. They are the most rare. So in this collaboration, we invited the community to reflect on what you want to sing a song for in this moment. And I would invite you all to reflect on that as well. And I think what you might want to sing a song for today could be different from what you want to sing a song for next week. And it might be different from what you want to sing a song for next year. In the collaboration, we invited people to write their answers or draw it or illustrate it, take a photo of it and send it in. And then the responses were taped to mimic, not exactly, but we mimicked each person's hand in the contribution. So this sign often accompanies me to the sewing circles. And this is some of the participants' work together. Today I was asked a question about my relationship with animals, and I said that in the studio we actually have a few dogs, and this is my dog Lenny. And I want to invite people to use the hashtag dogs for scale. Oh, saw that. We're almost to the end here. In fact, I'm going to speed through some things so we can just, I can answer some questions for you. This piece is in my current show at PDX Contemporary Art. And I had this really nice moment today where I ran into Jack Ryan and a student at the JSM. And I want to invite you all to go into the gallery that has the Helen Frankenthaler and the Mark Rothko. And I was saying that those two paintings evoke everything that fascinates me right now about horizons and sunrises and sunsets. And photographs fail to ever capture what that experience is. And part of it is because the phenomena, we'll just say that, of light and being blanketed in that space that is the horizon. And so it's something that I am trying to explore and understand in my current body of work. I think one thing that's important to know is that sometimes sunsets and sunrises are beautiful because of the chemicals and gases that we're putting into the air. The other thing that I think that's important to remember is that there's a sunrise happening somewhere in the world right now. So this is the piece that is a new exploration for me at PDX Contemporary Art. One thing I want to share that was very surreal is that because of the nature of how complicated this was to install, and that it was fabricated out of state, I saw it for the first time in person 2 days before it opened to the public. And one thing that actually in some ways saved me in the experience, I don't know, is that I worked with a friend named Peter Jennings, who is a great photographer, but also he's been doing all this CG rendering stuff. And so he actually helped me see what the sign was gonna look like before the piece was installed. So if anybody gets to PDX and if you see the card, the initial card is all a CG rendering. But it helped me anticipate how I might need to work with the space. So I feel so excited to use this quote. I use it all the time, but this is the place where it was meant to be used. Gordon Bettles, who was the retired steward of the University of Oregon's Many Nations Longhouse and who has since passed. He likes to say that my story changes when I know your story. And I think that that's why we're all in this space together today. So thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I'm like really happy to answer any questions. And I really like to be here where Gordon Bettles worked and led and was a student and has like this huge footprint. It's really special to be in this community right now. So thank you. Any questions? We all shy, tired, hangry? Yes.
Is your piece the one that's in the California dorm room?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Which one of the pieces was your favorite?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I will say that I was excited to come here today to revisit the piece Witness. And I think that as an artist, there's different pieces that teach me how to see and that transform me because of the act of seeing for a long time and looking at something. And when I found that photo of the potlatch, I didn't know all the things I learned about it. I spent a lot of time with it, and I saw a lot of things in it. And so like coming here today, it was like revisiting an old friend. It was like seeing, and my children are in it. So that was a pretty special piece to see today. And I would also say that I'm pretty excited about the very last piece I shared with you. But I still feel like I'm getting to experience it for the first time. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes?
In the neon piece, all of the words are doubled except young and ancient. I'm curious if
Yeah, well, let me start with the doubling of words, because I realized I didn't really talk about this. But for me, that call, when Marvin Gaye says mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister, I realized like that's about, like, it's an urgent call. I mean, it's a construct of songwriting for sure, but it's this urgent call, right? So it's like, how do we cast a word or an urgent message further in space? It is part of this long history of call and response. I also think that in an indigenous way, it's calling back to our ancestors and calling forward to future generations. Young and ancient are, I think, are descriptors where those other words are sort of nouns, right? The one thing that I think happens with doubled language, and I would love people to share their own response with me, but like, I think if you see a word once, then you kind of, it's almost like reading it, but when you see a word twice, then I feel asked to think more about my relationship to that word, or another, like an image is conjured in a different way because the word is said twice. I mean, one thing that so that is really why those two words are only listed once. I mean, I think a viewer could make any word pairing they want with words, and there's a few things that for me are like kind of little, what would you call it? What is that thing at the end of a movie when like they show you a little credit if you stay longer, like you get to see the little, what is that called? There's a word for it. My kids know the word for it. What is it?
Post-credit scene?
Well, it is the post-credit scene, but it's like the candy, or it's like the little, it's like the surprise you get because you're the super fan or whatever. Well, like for, so there's a really specific reference that acknowledges my kid in there's the yellow water and the yellow bear. And my daughter, when they were in middle school, they did a science project on tardigrades. So there's that little kind of water bear kind of reference in there. I mean, there's other things I really thought about with the language. Like the language is all very intentional in its location. I think any of the words can be pairings, but I think young and ancient, they tend to be the most could be knitted to anything.
If the windows weren't there, would you still hang it at that sort of ground, sort of earth level or whatever?
Yes. I mean, it was definitely designed thinking of this space, but it also was definitely designed wanting it to be at that level. And part of it is because I really do, one of the things I wanted to reference is a horizon and light at a horizon. And it's very intentional that light floods the ground. And so actually a really interesting story is there's institution thinking about collecting it, and they wanted to know if it could be hung higher. And I think that was more when they saw the CG rendering of it, perhaps. And then they saw it in person, and they're like, oh, we understand why it needs to be here. And I think the higher thing was more about safety and things not breaking and things like that. And I had to think about that too as an artist. Was it emphatic that it needed to be on the ground? The satin binding piece, it's at a different level. And so I thought, well, possibly, but I did also think that the intentionality there is very, it's important. It's deliberate, right? Yes?
When you have these kind of open collaborative projects where anyone can walk up and start working on it, how do you kind of stay true to the original idea you had for the piece, but also letting it be separated and kind of have this open interpretation for the final product? Because I struggle with thinking about someone else kind of letting in on something I'm doing, so I'm wondering how you do that as a professional.
I think that's such a good question. I'm really glad you asked it. I think that early on, I had experimented with other kind of sewing well, I had experimented, let me back up. Early on when I was on sabbatical, and I was it's the first time I was using blankets, and I was trying to stitch stuff for a show that was going to be at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I hadn't really started the sewing circles yet. And I think at first the sewing circles really to me were a barn raising. I'll help my neighbor, if you'd come and help me. And I didn't think I would be continuing doing it, whereas now I think of the sewing circles actually have taken on this completely different form and intention. But one thing I had to learn very early on is that it's it's part of the call and response, right? And so I learned how to let go of controlling what the outcome is. I do think that as an artist kind of questioning, how do you can still ask yourself, how do you set the table, right? So, and I think for me, setting the table means I'm not going to put 25 different colors of embroidery floss on the table. I'm going to limit my palette. Setting the table could be, I'm trying to think about how else, the truth of the matter is what I love about it, but I think it was a process of getting there, is that the work calls me to pay attention. The work calls me to listen to what it wants to be. I don't, when I start a sewing circle piece, I might have ideas about how things kind of thematically relate to each other, but oftentimes the composition doesn't announce itself until the collaborative process has kind of run its course. And then there's a lot of work that's done in the studio. I would just share that these pieces, oftentimes they don't get finished. They go like from maybe one sewing circle to another. There's a lot of like handwork and finish work and knots tied and things. And I like that that's part of the character of the work, but it's a very, like in that particular case, especially for hand stitch stuff, it's a very slow process, and it requires a lot of kind of attention. But it's what I love, because I end up learning things and seeing things, and it's great. I'd like to, if you want to talk afterwards, though, I'd like to hear about what your practice is and like how we can scheme on like with your variables. Yeah. Yes.
I think at the start, when I saw the pieces of the blankets stacked up together, I really just like couldn't stop thinking about consumerism and all of those blankets as like products and where they come from. So I was wondering if maybe you could just expand on how you chose the blankets, how you acquired them, or did you reject any, that kind of thing? Because I don't know, that's just like an interesting facet of like that project that maybe wasn't the focus.
Yeah, no, I think that is it's a really great question, and one I haven't been asked before with that specific focus. So when I collaborate on a project, every single blanket that comes in is included. Everybody, it's like, I think everybody's voice is really important, so there's no exclusions that happen, and I think that people who self-select themselves to participate like that, like becomes part of this like community and this relationship between part and whole, and it becomes part of the story that's told. With the blankets that I get from thrift stores, I also like, now it's like really changed, but when I started, you know, they were at my favorite thrift store in Abundance, the red, white, and blue. Everything's like 50% off on Saturdays, except for the new tag color. And I was getting wool blankets, and I specifically set up the criteria for myself that I would not buy a blanket for aesthetic purposes, that it was like, I was purchasing it as a material, which I think was really valuable, because it means that there's blankets that I wouldn't have, like, I might have misjudged or mischaracterized, right? I mean, these blankets, the thing that's so interesting about them is that they're objects that like immigrate with us. They have labels. They've come from all over the world. They have mended spots and stains and worn bindings, and like all of those elements are like beauty marks, and they're part of their stories. And so I like in creating a sculpture like that, I think of it a little bit as like, and it's one of the references even in those sculptures is like, the sculpture is sort of like references linen closets, and it references totems, and it references like Brancusi's endless column and the conifers that like we are surrounded with here in the Pacific Northwest. So the consumer part of it, I haven't really thought about. I think, and I also think that their history, which they come with as like kind of secondhand objects, I think that they often, hopefully they escaped that narrative a little bit of consumerism, because they are so obviously like used. And when I say used, I kind of mean it in the most, like the patina that comes with something that's used, when it's something that has this history. Like, it makes me think of like what makes a family heirloom, and there's going to be exceptions to this rule for some people, but I think like if I asked most of you in this space to like think about like what's like an heirloom that you have personally that's an heirloom in the making, or what's something that you've inherited or that you would like to inherit, most of those objects are things that like what makes them special is like the story that we attach to them. It's not the you know, value. Yes.
You mentioned several experiences as artists in residence, and I was wondering what kind of impact these experiences have on your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I love artist in residence experiences. I would say that as a parent, it has been much more like difficult to do artists in resident experiences. But even then, I think sometimes, like, because my work takes me on the road to collaborate. There is an exchange that's kind of artist in resident like. I think the value of artist in residencies are that you know, you have this space set aside to like work on your practice, but there also there's this element of like collaboration that happens. And I also think that when you're working with people and you have this like finite like window of time to do that work together, you open yourself up in a way that is different than other spaces, right? And so I think that that's like one of the values of artist residencies, and I encourage people to do them. And truthfully, like I imagine myself maybe doing some in the future, but I definitely like I think that they're really great spaces. It goes back to that Gordon Bettles quote, right? Like, I think that like when you learn somebody else's story, especially in that space where there's a bunch of creative people, like your work can't help but like change and hopefully get better. Yeah.
I had the opportunity to walk around today.
Thanks,
I
Beth.
really appreciate that. You had this great conversation with one of the faculty members.
With Jack here, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it'd be great for the students, I'm going to pull one part out of it out, to hear you guys talking about that conversation, the imposter syndrome. Which I, like, even my intern that was with me was like, oh my God, this person who is established and, you know, has gone on residencies, is, you know, we look to your art as being the artist, and here you were talking about that, and unsure of even coming in front of us and talking about your work today.
Yeah.
Because I think we really, right?
It's funny, so I ran into Jack Ryan at the museum today, and I was telling him how nervous I was and that I had a lot of anxiety. I even called my husband. I'm like, oh, I have so much anxiety. And it's true. Like, honestly, I was like, I believe in therapy, and I'm like, I need a therapist. Like, because it was just like, I mean, I don't want to go into that TMI area, but I do think that, yeah, like artists have, I think that I don't know. For a long time, I have to just like confess that it wasn't until I'm 54. When I turned 50, I thought, oh, that was the year that the big cedar canine was created. And I was like, all right, like, I don't have time to like, you know, for a lot of self-doubt, which I do have that too, but I'm like, I have less time for self-doubt. I have things to say. I'm gonna like, this is my time. I can't apologize. I need to like be out in the world, because, you know, I mean, I think about this a little bit. You know, like, my parents are in their 80s. I'm like, the next 15 years, the next 20 years, like really important window of time for me. And I wish I wish less of it. Actually, I feel like I'm giving myself a little bit of advice here. Wish less of it was actually spent doubting myself. But I also think, you know what, that's part of the process. Like, if I wasn't nervous, like really nervous, like maybe I wouldn't, I don't know. Like, I think you have to like have your heart in the game, and that like, you have to have your heart in the work. You have to have your heart in the classroom or in the audience. Like, that's important to me. But it also sometimes really does feel a little bit paralyzing, and I don't know if that's my unique tick as an artist, but I have a feeling that basically, you know, I think it's not uncommon for artists to have that. Jack, can you please get me out of this ditch I'm digging?
I'm in a good place right now.
Well, that's what he said, although he did give me a really good, what was the quote you talked about in the artist studio visit that you had with Michelle Grabner?
Yeah, she had said, oh, isn't it great to be this age? You can't to second guess yourself anymore. It's too late for me to second guess myself, I think was what she said.
Yeah, I need to like hang that quote up. I need to like stitch it, beat it. Yes.
There's a deep into her career. She's been showing for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, whatever. And if you're so successful, why do you feel like an imposter? So,
Yeah.
it seems to happen.
Yeah, I think it happens. Why do we do that to ourselves?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you, everyone. It's been a real, thank you for it not feeling that bad, ultimately. All that worry I had. Thank you.